Okay, going back to the 1906 revolution, recall that in the last segment we talked about how Morgan Schuster was forced to leave, and now the British and the Russians were in Iran, and they were influencing the outcome of it, and so the revolution in a sense is lost because of the foreign intervention. So the revolutionaries, with the Russian and British intervention, they lose power, and as a result of that loss, with the help of the Russians and the British, again, royal dictatorship is restored. This kind of a change that I just mentioned is repeated pattern throughout much of the Middle East history, and you will see that happening elsewhere. So I just wanted to call your attention that this is not unique to Iran, it is a pattern. I should also add that another reason one could cite for external intervention was the imperialist, in this case Russia and Britain, fear of chaos. As you know, revolutionary change almost by definition will be, at least initially, chaotic. The change that takes place involves toppling of the old order, and by the time you establish a new order, there is this vacuum that gives the impression of chaos, and sometimes there is indeed chaos. The imperial powers really did not like chaos because chaos made it more unpredictable for them to understand what was going on and how their interest was being impacted. So the upshot of the situation is that we're having liberal Britain and conservative Tsarist Russia uniting to overthrow the revolution of 1905-1906. Now, after the overthrow of the revolutions, Iran's control system should be now examined. So that's what I want to do. So if you go to the year 1912, after the overthrow of the revolution, this is the way the control system works. At the primary level, you have coercion going up. So coercion goes all the way from tertiary to the primary level, but this time the coercive force is provided by the Russian and the British troops. They're the one who are running the show in that area, in terms of control. NH, I am mapping it below that because when it is combined with coercion, if you recall, I say that it designates a sense of resignation that prevailed in the country. In other words, Iranians felt that they really don't have the power to get rid of the influence of the foreigners, and as a result, therefore, it's useless. So the failure of the revolution really lowered the sense of efficacy, because the foreigners at the end were able to get rid of the revolution. I would also map you at where it was, not much of a change. Finally, normative active would be way down. Again, Iran is a pre-mass political society, but even in cities like Tehran and Tabriz, the major cities, the masses, there is no symbol available to the ruling elites to be able to manipulate and excite the masses to give them any sense of legitimacy. So in 1912, the British and the Russian troops are providing the coercion. Now, it is tempting at this point to ask what historians call counterfactual conditional. What if type of a question. What if foreign powers had not intervened? Would the revolution have succeeded? What would have been the revolution's fate, in other words, had there not been outside external intervention? Well, one potential pattern could have been a return to a status quo ante. In other words, one could argue, perhaps, even without foreign intervention, the revolutionaries would have lost and the old patterns would have returned. So that would mean the traditional elites who were anti-change, mostly in the cities of Tehran and Tabriz, would begin to unite with the landowners and landed aristocracy, the feudal elements of the society, and be able to confront the revolutionaries. So the question is, would that have been sufficient to topple the revolutionaries, to topple the pro-change elites? Well, we actually have a reasonable test of that proposition. In other words, was it possible to restore the old system? Well, what actually happened after the overthrow of the revolution was that the British and Russian did, in fact, try to restore the traditional system. Now remember, in the traditional system, NH would be way up there at the top because it denotes people's acquiescence to the dominant norms. And they tried to push NH at a primary as if the revolution had not happened. But that didn't work because they simply could not get masses to comply, so coercion had to move way up on top, above NH, in order to impose that system. So it was no longer possible, once the revolution had occurred in Iran, it was no longer possible to restore the old control system that was characteristic of traditional society. It was like as if you were going to, after discovery of fire, you were going to outlaw it. It was impossible. So the old system could not be restored. So in sum, the ouster of liberals was very, very hard to manage by the counter elites, and they needed the support of the foreigners. It was hard to control popular groups in the cities who were for the revolution and who had now lost power. So therefore, the coercion had to be at the very top, and it had to be provided by the foreigners rather than indigenous force. So this is one of the important things to remember about the 1905-1906 revolution, that it made going back to the old system virtually impossible. Now, Iranians began to learn a few lessons from their very first revolution that eventually failed. Among them was that the liberal group was overthrown primarily because of external intervention. The indigenous opposition simply was not strong enough to overthrow them without foreign help. So that was one of the important lessons that was learned. Secondly, a growing belief became established among many Iranians that the liberal Western democracies always have a secret agreement that will not allow them dignity and independence. And of course, that secret agreement refers to that I mentioned from last segment, the 1907 secret agreement. In other words, the belief was now beginning to be established that the Western liberal democracy are not going to support democratic movement for the so-called lower races. So to many Iranians, liberals appear to be hypocrites. After all, when the chips are down and when it comes to non-Western nations, liberals and conservatives pretty much follow the same policy. It's hard to find any meaningful difference between them. So much for liberalism as far as it serving as a liberating ideology. Also note that at this juncture, the only country that is spared such a judgment in the West is none other than the United States, and that is primarily because of Morgan Schuster episode, which we discussed. United States, as represented by Morgan Schuster to Iranian, was the only country that tried to help them, was committed to them, and therefore, because of that, the belief was that U.S., you can count on the United States to help you. So the third lesson of the revolution, I already mentioned this will not allow dignity and independence for them, so let me move to the third one. The traditional elites, you will see, are going to lose legitimacy. If you're a liberal elite and you see the landlords, the landed aristocracy, the traditional elites cooperating with the occupying powers, with the imperial powers, you are going to regard them as illegitimate. In fact, many of the people cooperating with the imperialist power were some of your relatives or even family members. And again, this is going to be a general pattern in much of the Middle East, namely that you will see it elsewhere. For example, this is the pattern one would see in Palestinians and in Syria during the Civil War, that some of your own relatives end up to be cooperating with the enemy. So when the traditional elites begin to ally themselves with the Westerners, their legitimacy is compromised. They lose nationalistic legitimacy. Now, during the Cold War, this pattern also manifested itself. The more nationalistically legitimate leaders were mostly friendly to Soviet Union, and the less legitimate leaders were friendly with the United States and the Europeans, especially the Britain. Finally, I'd like to mention that foreign intervention did, in fact, end the 1905-06 revolution, but the failed revolution was not coup de grace for Iran's democratic movement. In other words, it wasn't an end of it. In 1912, you will see that we are now getting close to World War I, and the liberal elements is very desperate to find a way to free themselves from the British yoke. So the liberal elements decide to side with the Germans, not because they particularly cared for the Germans, but because they saw the British as their primary tormentors. So in the West, therefore, because of these liberals' gravitation toward the Germans, a mythology began to take shape. And that mythology says that liberals in the Middle East like the authoritarian Germans over the liberal West. But the fact of the matter was that this was not an ideological attraction at all. For the Iranians, for the Arab liberals, siding with the Germans during World War I, and then again you will see that happen during World War II, was always done on a purely strategic basis, not an ideological one. They ally with anyone in position to defeat the British, the French, and their Russian tormentors. So in 1912, lots of liberals went on the side of the Germans, hoping that the Germans would end up defeating the British and Russians and thereby allowing them to gain genuine independence. Now, in a few years later, suddenly you have a very important event, and that is the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. So Russia becomes Soviet Union, and the new communist government declares that the Tsarist policy toward Iran had been improper because it was imperialist. And therefore, Russia, or now the Soviet Union, decides to leave Iran. Suddenly, with the Russians gone, the British are left all alone without a competitor. So what do? They try to take immediate advantage of the vacuum left by the Soviet departure and try to impose on Iranian a hideous 1919 Anglo-Persian agreement. This agreement is one that calls for indirect control of Iran. Remember now, the Russians are gone, and therefore it's easy. And further, the agreement stipulates that Iranians actually pay for their own subjugation. They pay the British for their own subjugation. Now, the idea behind this agreement was that the British wanted to be still imperial power, but at the lowest possible cost. So to do that, they had to rely on local indigenous people to serve for them. And that required to do a couple of things. One, to train a good coercive force that could smash the head of opposition, with the indigenous military taking on the role of the British and the Russian soldiers as they step down and they go home. So they wanted to create a force that would have a good coercive element to it, but it's staffed by the indigenous population. Second, they realized that the treasury is bankrupt, and for Iran to even be able to be a functioning country, they need to train some people in finance and also provide some education. Note that this is a paternalistic colonial rule formula which, because of changing times, as the country moves from a feudal society to a more modern state, you need to undertake in order to have a functioning country. Now, the main obstacle in the path of the British plan were, of course, the liberal elites who didn't want any of it. The liberal elites saw this agreement as nothing short of a colonial control, and they didn't like it a bit. But then the other strange episode that I alluded to earlier takes place, and this episode involves United States foreign policy at this particular juncture. During this period in 1919, Woodrow Wilson is the President of the United States, and Robert Lansing is the Secretary of State. What the British did was to bribe their Iranian agents to spread a rumor that the United States actually favored the terms of 1919 Anglo-Persian agreement. When the words got to Secretary of State Lansing, he was simply furious. And he instructed the American mission in Iran, and remember, U.S. didn't have an embassy, they called it a mission, to actually distribute a pamphlet saying not only the United States does not favor the agreement, but in fact opposes it. You can imagine that this was truly an electrifying moment for the pro-change elites and the masses, because once again the Americans came to their help. And the United States again appeared as the exception to the rule among the Western powers because they sided with the Iranians. When that happened, some of the elites got bold, and in fact, some of them decided to choose terror. They killed some Iranian collaborators. Again, as I alluded to earlier, this is a common pattern throughout the Middle East. You will see it, you saw it for example, in occupied Palestine and in Lebanon and in Syria, that collaborators are viewed as fair game, so to speak. Now, with the liberals deciding to sharply react to this agreement, since the British commitment was not very high at this stage, they just wanted the cheapest empire as possible, the terror this time around actually worked, and the British decided to give up the plan. But they still hadn't given up the idea of keeping Iran on a short leash.